At 68 years old, Ida Mercer owed more money than she would ever see again in her lifetime, and the bank in the town of Ashford Hollow intended to collect every last cent of it. Her late husband's failed mining venture had left behind nothing but debts, and when the bank's agent, a clipped, humorless man named Reginald Cobb, came to seize what remained of her small holdings, he offered her one final parcel in place of a debt she could never repay, a barren, blackened stretch of ruined mining land the bank considered worthless, poisoned by decades of runoff and abandoned by every prospector who'd ever laid eyes on it. Ida signed the paper with $6 still in her apron pocket, the last of her money, and walked away owning nothing but scorched earth nobody wanted. Folks called it the cruelest kind of charity, handing a ruined widow a ruined patch of ground just to close the books. But beneath that blighted soil lay something buried decades before that would not only lift Ida out of ruin, it would settle a debt the whole valley had long since forgotten was owed. Settle in, and let us tell you the story of Ida Mercer. If you're watching from a place that feels forgotten, tell us in the comments. Ida had been born in 1839 in a hardscrabble mining settlement in the Colorado foothills, the eldest daughter of a sayer named Silas Petrie, a meticulous, soft-spoken man whose trade was reading the truth out of rock that lied to everyone else. Silas worked with mining companies that came and went to foothills like weather, testing or samples brought to him by hopeful, exhausted men who wanted desperately to believe their claims held color, and it was his particular gift, honed over 30 years of careful work, to tell them plainly when a rock held nothing and to tell them just as plainly on the rare occasions when it held everything. He kept young Ida beside him at his testing bench more often than her mother liked, teaching her to read veins of, or the way other fathers taught daughters to read scripture, showing her how tailings and slag could tell a story about what the earth had given up and, just as importantly, what it had chosen to keep. Ground doesn't lie, Ida girl, he used to tell her, turning a gray chunk of rock over in his stained fingers beneath the assay office lamp. But it doesn't volunteer the truth either. You have to know how to ask it properly, and you have to be patient enough to wait for the answer. Her mother, Constance, had come from a family of modest means back east and had never fully reconciled herself to the roughness of mining camp life, and she died of consumption when Ida was 14, leaving Silas to raise Ida and her younger brother largely alone amid the noise and grime of assay offices and stamp mills. Ida grew into a quiet, observant young woman, skilled with her father's testing equipment, capable of reading a landscape scarred by mining activity the way a doctor might read a patient's history in old scars and heel breaks, understanding which wounds in the earth were merely cosmetic and which ran down to something deeper and more permanent. Silas often took on work assessing abandoned claims for companies, deciding whether old ground was worth reworking, and Ida absorbed, almost without realizing it, an entire education in how mining operations left their marks on land long after the men who dug them had moved on, how tailings piles and added openings and diverted streams told stories that outlasted the memory of the men who'd made them. She married at 21 to a hopeful young prospector named Walter Mercer, a man whose optimism about striking a rich vein someday outpaced, by a considerable margin, his actual success at doing so. Walter was a kind man, gentle with Ida and later with their 2 children, but he possessed a persistent belief that the next claim, the next vein, the next investment would finally be the one that changed their fortunes, and over 3 decades of marriage, Ida watched him sink money and hope into one disappointing venture after another, always with the same unshakable faith that this time will be different. She learned, through those years, to manage a household on uncertain income, to stretch what little they had, to can and preserve and mend rather than replace, and to keep her own counsel about Walter's ventures even when her father's train I told her, plainly as any say report, that a given claim held nothing but false promise. She loved her husband too much to crush his hope outright. Though she quietly kept a small private fund of her own, money saved from selling preserves and mending clothes for neighbors against the day she suspected might eventually come. That day arrived in spring of Ida's 66th year, when Walter, convinced he had finally found a vein that would redeem 30 years of disappointment, borrowed heavily against their small house and remaining savings to develop a claim in a played-out stretch of hills the locals called the Cinder Flats, ground so thoroughly worked over by earlier operations that even Ida's untrained neighbors considered a fool's investment. Walter died of sudden fever 18 months into the venture, before the mine had produced anything but debt, and Ida found herself a widow not merely grieving but drowning, the full weight of her husband's borrowed optimism now resting entirely on her own narrow shoulders, with creditors circling before the ground beneath his grave had even properly settled. The bank in Ashford Hollow, holding a note against nearly everything Walter had mortgaged, moved with the brisk efficiency of an institution uninterested in a widow's grief, and Reginald Cobb, the agent sent to manage the foreclosure, was a man who performed his duties with a flat, unbothered thoroughness of someone who had long since stopped seeing faces in the ledgers he balanced. He seized the small house first, then what furniture and possessions carried resale value, and when the accounting still left Ida owing a modest remaining sum the bank had little practical hope of ever collecting from a penniless widow, Cobb offered what he clearly considered a tidy administrative solution. The deed to the abandoned cinder flats claim itself, transferred into Ida's name in full satisfaction of the remaining debt, since the bank had no use for blighted, unworkable ground and no interest in the paperwork of pursuing further payment from a woman with nothing left to give. Ida understood the offer for what it was, a way for the bank to close its books cleanly rather than any act of mercy, but she signed the papers anyway, because refusing changed nothing about her circumstances, and because some stubborn thread of her father's old patience told her that ground, even ruined ground, was rarely as empty as men in a hurry believed it to be. She left the bank's office with $6 in her apron pocket, the very last of the small private fund she'd saved through 30 years of preserves and mended clothes, and she walked the 4 miles out to the cinder flats alone, since there was by that point nowhere else that belonged to her at all. The land, when she arrived, matched every unkind word she'd heard said about it. Years of runoff from upstream mining operations had left the soil blackened and barren across long stretches, streaked with mineral staining that killed anything green foolish enough to try rooting there. The whole flat pockmarked with collapsed adits and rusted equipment abandoned by companies that had stripped what value they could and left a mess for someone else to inherit. Neighbors who noticed her walking the property exchanged the same pitying glances Ida had grown accustomed to since Walter's death, certain the widow Mercer had simply traded one hopeless situation for another, poisoned ground for a mortgaged house, with nothing gained and everything still lost. But Ida walked the cinder flats the way her father had taught her to walk any ground whose story hadn't yet been properly asked, and rather than seeing only the ruin at the surface, she found herself noting details that her father's training told her mattered more than blackened soil and rusted equipment. The original workings, she observed, had been abandoned rather suddenly, judging by tools left mid-task and timber shoring still partially installed in one of the older adits, as though whatever company had worked this ground had left in haste rather than through the slow exhaustion of a vein finally run dry. That kind of abrupt abandonment, her father had always said, sometimes meant a claim had failed for reasons having nothing to do with the ore itself, and Ida found herself wondering, standing amid the ruin with her $6 and nothing else to her name, whether the cinder flats had truly given up everything it once held, or whether someone, in leaving so quickly, had left something behind unfinished. She began exploring the old workings in the days that followed, borrowing a lantern and basic tools from a sympathetic neighbor, a widower named Amos Hargrove, who remembered Walter fondly and worried privately about Ida managing alone on such ruined ground. It was in the oldest of the abandoned adits, the one showing signs of that hurried, unfinished abandonment, that Ida's lantern light caught something her trained eye recognized immediately as wrong for a simple mine tunnel, a section of the tunnel wall reinforced not with the rough timber shoring used elsewhere, but with carefully fitted stonework, deliberate and skilled in a way that spoke of purpose rather than mere structural necessity. Her father's old training told her that miners rarely wasted careful masonry on ground they intended to abandon, and her heart quickened with the particular recognition he had always described, the sense of ground finally offering up an answer to a question asked properly and patiently. It took her the better part of a week, working carefully in the evenings after tending what little garden she could coax from the unpoisoned edges of property, prying loose the fitted stones one at a time with patience rather than force, mindful of her father's old lesson that haste ruins more discoveries than caution ever costs. Behind the reinforced stonework, she found a sealed chamber, dry and remarkably preserved by the same careful construction that had concealed it, and within that chamber, wrapped in oiled canvas that had held against decades of damp mountain air, she found a heavy iron strong-box, its lock rusted, but it seemed still largely sound. It took Amos Hargrove's help and a rusted crowbar to finally force the strong box open one evening in Ida's small rented room in Ashford Hollow, And when the lid gave way, she found inside not merely coin, though there was a modest quantity of that as well, but something that struck her, upon careful reading by lamplight, as considerably more valuable than gold alone: a leather-bound journal and a set of carefully drawn survey maps, both belonging, according to the journal's opening pages, to a mining engineer named Cornelius Thistlewood, who had worked the Cinder Flats claim some 4 decades earlier under a company called the Ashford Valley Mining Concern. Ida spent that first night and many nights following tracing Thistlewood's careful, methodical handwriting by lamplight, and what she found in his journal was not the story of a failed claim at all, but the account of discovery its owners had deliberately buried rather than developed. Thistlewood's surveys, cross-referenced against his increasingly troubled journal entries, revealed that the Cinder Flats sat above a substantial vein, one considerably richer than anything the surface workings had ever officially reported, but that the mining concern's owners, upon learning of the vein's true extent, had made a calculated decision to abandon the claim rather than develop it further, for reasons Thistlewood's later entries made increasingly uncomfortably clear. The vein, it turned out, ran directly beneath a section of the valley's primary water table, and Thistlewood's surveys, along with his own increasingly anguished notes, documented his growing certainty that further extraction would poison the valley's water supply for a generation or more, contaminating not merely the immediate mining ground, but the wells and streams at half of Ashford Hollow, depended upon for drinking water and irrigation both. Rather than risk the expense and liability of managing that contamination properly, the Ashford Valley Mining Concern's owners, according to Thistlewood's furious final entries, had simply abandoned the claim outright, walking away from a fortune in, or rather than spend the money to extract it safely, and swearing their small crew to silence about the vein's true extent and the reasons for its abandonment, a silence purchased, Thistlewood's journal made clear, with bonuses paid to every man, who agreed never to speak of what they'd found. Thistlewood himself, it seemed, had never fully made peace with his own silence, and his journal's final pages, written in a hand grown shaky with what Ida guessed to be illness or advancing age, describe his intention to eventually return to the valley and see the matter properly addressed, whether through honest disclosure to the mining company's later owners or through some private effort of his own to manage the contamination risk he'd helped conceal. Whatever his intentions, they had evidently gone unfulfilled. The sealed chamber and its contents left undisturbed for 4 decades until Ida's patient, trained, I had finally asked the ground the right question at last. Ida sat with Thistlewood's journal long into those first nights, understanding with clarity that settled over her like her father's old lessons finally come full circle that she had inherited not merely a hidden fortune, but a decades-old danger that half of Ashford Hollow remained entirely unaware it was living beside. She thought of her father's old words about ground never volunteering the truth, but never quite lying either. And she thought of the families throughout the valley drawing water from wells that might, in time, draw poison instead, families who had no notion that the ground beneath their homes held both a fortune and a threat, sealed together by men more interested in avoiding liability than protecting the people who would come after them. She resolved, without any real hesitation, that whatever the Cinder Flats held, both the wealth and the warning, would be brought properly into the light, whatever it cost her personally to do so. Word of Ida's discoveries at the Cinder Flats could not remain contained in a valley the size of Ashford Hollow, and it was not long before Reginald Cobb, the bank's agent who had arranged the original transfer of the ruined claim, arrived at Ida's door with an entirely different demeanor than he'd shown during foreclosure, insisting that any valuable minerals discovered on the property rightfully belonged to the bank, on the technical grounds that the original transfer had been made in satisfaction of debt without full knowledge of the property's actual worth, and that Ida's ownership was therefore, in his careful legal phrasing, fraudulently obtained by virtue of information asymmetry. It was a claim built more on the bank's sudden greed than on any sound legal footing, but Cobb had already begun quietly courting the valley's water commissioner and several prominent landowners, framing Ida as a woman who had somehow deceived the bank into an unfavorable transaction, conveniently omitting that the bank itself had considered the ground worthless at the very moment it handed the deed over. The matter came before a hastily assembled hearing at the valley's water commission office, called ostensibly to address the contamination risk Ida herself had voluntarily reported, but which Cobb clearly intended to use as an opportunity to challenge her ownership of the claim itself. The room filled with anxious landowners and farmers whose wells drew from the same water table Thistlewood's journal described, along with curious townsfolk who had heard whispers of buried treasure and old company secrets. And Ida stood before the commissioner with Thistlewood's journal in her weather hands, understanding that the room's attention was divided between fear of contaminated water and fascination with rumored gold, and that she would need to address both honestly if she meant to keep either her ownership or the valley's trust. Rather than argue technical points of contract law with Cobb, Ida simply began reading from Thistlewood's journal itself his surveys, his growing anguish over concealed danger, his final unfulfilled intention to see the matter properly addressed, and she laid out, plainly and without embellishment, exactly what she had found and exactly what she believed needed to happen next. Careful, expert assessment of the contamination risk, proper sealing of the dangerous sections of the old workings, and only then, if the engineers deemed it safe, careful extraction of the remaining or under conditions that wouldn't repeat the previous company's reckless abandonment. The room grew very quiet as she spoke. Farmers who had spent years quietly worried about unexplained mineral taste in certain wells finally hearing an explanation that made unsettling sense, and several old-timers who remembered the original mining concern's abrupt departure decades before began nodding, recalling rumors they'd never fully credited about the reasons behind it. It was Amos Hargrove, rising unbidden from the gathered crowd, who tipped the room's sentiment decisively, declaring that he'd watched Ida Mercer walk poisoned ground alone with nothing but patience and her father's old training, and that any bank willing to claim a widow's honestly earned discovery after handing her worthless land in the first place did not deserve to call its own conduct honest. Murmurs of agreement spread through the assembled crowd, several voices pointing out that Cobb's sudden interest in the claim's fraudulent transfer rang considerably less sincere than his enthusiasm for closing the books on a hopeless widow's debt months before. The water commissioner, whatever pressure Cobb had attempted to apply beforehand, could not ignore a room full of frightened well owners far more interested in safe water than in the bank's technical grievances, and he ruled that Ida's ownership stood exactly as originally transferred, with the added stipulation that any future extraction proceed only under proper safety oversight, a condition Ida herself had proposed and welcomed without argument. With her ownership settled in Thistlewood surveys as her guide, Ida spent the following year working with mining engineers brought in from the territorial capital to properly assess and seal the dangerous sections of the old workings, funding the careful, expensive work with a portion of the Strongbox's coin and, later, with royalties from a modest, carefully managed extraction that followed once the engineers confirmed the vein could be worked safely without threatening the water table. Rather than pursue the full fortune Thistlewood surveys suggested lay beneath the flats, Ida insisted on conservative, responsible extraction, directing a significant portion of the proceeds toward a permanent valley water trust intended to fund ongoing monitoring of every well in Ashford Hollow, ensuring no family would ever again drink from a well without knowing, plainly and honestly, exactly what ran beneath their land. Amos Hargrove, working alongside her through that long year of careful excavation, became not merely a helpful neighbor, but a steady partner in the trust establishment, and the valley's farmers, once anxious about contaminated water, came instead to see the old cinder flats not as a blight, but as a place where their valley's safety had finally been properly secured after decades of unknowing risk. Reginald Cobb, his credibility badly damaged by the hearing and by murmurs throughout Ashford Hollow about the bank's opportunistic reversal, was quietly reassigned to a distant branch within a year, and the bank itself, eager to repair its standing with the community that had watched its conduct closely, became one of the Water Trust's earliest and most generous contributors, a fact Ida noted without bitterness, understanding that shame, properly applied, sometimes accomplished what argument alone never could. At 68 years old, forced into debt by a husband's hopeful failures and handed a ruined patch of poisoned ground in place of debt she could never repay, Ida Mercer had walked on a ground everyone believed empty of anything but ruin, and beneath its blackened soil she had found not merely a fortune, but the unfinished conscience of a man who had buried a danger rather than face the cost of fixing it. She brought both the fortune and the warning into the light, and in doing so, she secured a valley's water for generations to come, and in the process, she secured something in herself that 30 years of watching her husband's failed hopes and a bank's cold arithmetic had very nearly convinced her she'd lost for good. The truest karma in her story was never the bank's quiet embarrassment, though that came all the same, It was the plain, undeniable proof that ground, like a woman written off as ruined, rarely gives up its full truth to anyone unwilling to ask patiently and stay long enough to hear the answer. Ida Mercer lived out the remainder of her years in Ashford Hollow, respected as a founder and steadfast guardian of a water trust that would go on long after her passing, to protect the valley's wells through decades of growth and change. She never remarried, never sought recognition beyond what naturally came to a woman who had done something so plainly necessary and good, and she kept her father's old rock hammer on a shelf in her modest home until the end of her days, a reminder, she liked to say, that ground never volunteers its truth, but it never quite lies either. If you're patient enough to ask it properly, thank you for spending this time with Ida's story. If it moved you, we'd be grateful if you shared it with someone who might need reminding that it's never too late for an overlooked life to matter tremendously. We'd love to know, what is a time you found real value in something or someone that others had already written off? Tell us in the comments below. Until next time, stay close.